Last week, the news that had been kept secret for nearly 3 months finally broke.
You're a pedophile!
Australia's highest-ranking Catholic, the man who rose to be the Vatican's third most powerful cleric, had been convicted of sexual crimes against 2 13-year-old boys. A jury of 12 had found George Pell guilty of 5 shocking offences, which all took place inside St Patrick's Cathedral when Pell was Archbishop of Melbourne. A suppression order banning publication of those convictions was lifted last week after the Crown decided to drop a second trial against the Cardinal on separate charges.
He was a man that was so high up in the hierarchy that he believed he was untouchable. But we believe that justice wouldn't be served, that we're just wasting our time and effort.
Please! Just move out. Just create space, people.
The credibility of the institutional church is at an all-time low. And this is what is so devastating about this conviction. It just makes it worse.
Watching his progression and his climbing within the Catholic Church, his name was regularly within the press, and every time Pell's name was there, a very clear recollection of what he'd been up to.
And what did you think?
I think, just a dirty, rotten, sneaky, conniving bastard.
I've been following this case for 3 years, since I first met a group of men who broke decades of silence to reveal allegations of how their innocence was stolen by Cardinal George Pell when they were young boys. Tonight on Four Corners, the inside story of how a prince of the church was brought to justice. It was 1996, and George Pell was the newly installed Archbishop of Melbourne. The church was grappling with an escalating scandal over clergy sexual abuse of children, and the Archdiocese of Melbourne had more pedophile priests than anywhere else in the country. Archbishop George Pell was in damage control.
1 or 2 lonely voices have suggested that the Catholic Church here is in a state of crisis. They are badly mistaken.
Archbishop Pell.
Thanks, Alyssa.
In October 1996, Pell launched the Melbourne Response, the church's new strategy for dealing with sexual abuse victims.
But I do want to stress that this is a genuine attempt to lessen the sufferings of the victims and to lessen the sufferings of their families. I'm hopeful that with further improvements and refinements over time, these initiatives will go a long way towards addressing this sad and deeply regrettable issue.
This was the public face of George Pell. But only a few months after that press conference, we now know that the Archbishop was doing exactly what his scheme was set up to address: sexually abusing children. This was the case put by the Crown.
As Your Honour pleases, members of the jury, it's alleged in this case that on a Sunday morning in the latter part of 1996, Archbishop George Pell, as he was then known, was saying 11 a.m. Mass at St Patrick's Cathedral here in East Melbourne. As was customary during Sunday Mass, the St Patrick's Cathedral Church Choir was singing, accompanied by an organist.
There were 61 boys in the choir. About half of them were sopranos.
So the sopranos were like the younger children, and then there was the altos, which is when your voice starts to break, then you turn into a tenor and a bass. The higher you're up, you look after the little boys. You look after them, and you sort of, they're only little kids, you got to show them a bit of, discipline. No, don't do that, do this. But at the end of the day, you're still a child yourself. but you should always, help them out, look after them.
The choir boys were all on scholarships to attend the nearby St Kevin's College in wealthy Toorak. Andrew LaGreca was one of the older boys in the choir.
It was a big deal. It was a big deal. And for a northern boy to sort of go all the way to Toorak, it was prestige, and it was quite an achievement that your parents were proud of you, you were proud of, and to say that I went to school at St Kevin's, which is a prestige school, lots of opportunities.
He says George Pell was often there when the boys practiced.
It was just George Pell, the Archbishop, the priest that lives at the church. He came to visit us. We didn't know if he lived there, lived somewhere else, but we just assumed because it's the Archbishop, he lives at the church and used to be around, listening to the choir, coming past to say hello, say thank you. We thought of it as a mark of respect that he used to take notice of us.
On the day of the incident, the choir had just finished singing and filed out of St Patrick's in procession.
You're singing, the mass is finished, everyone's still standing around just watching you sing, and then everyone claps as soon as the carol's finished, and it's like playing a game of football and you score the winning goal, everyone's just clapping and cheering you on. It was a sense of achievement, sense of gratitude.
Two of the boys left the rest of the group.
Both boys took the opportunity to have some fun, to be naughty, mischievous kids. They slipped away from the procession once the procession was outside the cathedral and away from the public gaze. Once inside the cathedral, this is after Mass, they then entered an unlocked door and walked down a corridor that led down to the sacristy.
It's a big church, there's lots of space. Anyone can get lost. There's 60 kids and there was never, if someone was missing, you wouldn't be able to tell because everyone would just hurry up, get changed, let's go home.
The two boys were swigging from the altar wine when George Pell caught them in the act.
Pell asked the boys, "What are you doing here?" and told them that they were in trouble. Pell approached the two boys. He then proceeded to manoeuvre his robes so as to pull out his penis. He pulled the first boy aside and had him crouch in front of him. Pell was standing. At this time, the boy asked to be let go, as they hadn't done anything wrong. Pell had his hand on the back of the boy's head and his other hand at his own genital area. The other boy saw the first boy's head being lowered towards the genital area of Pell.
When he'd finished with the first boy, George Pell moved on to the second.
It's alleged that Pell was standing and he pushed the other boy down to a position where he was crouching or kneeling. The boy was then pushed onto Pell's erect penis so that the penis was in his mouth. This act of fellatio or oral sex lasted for a short period, which the boy estimates to be a couple of minutes. You'll hear that Pell then stopped and told the boy to remove his pants. The boy stood upright and pulled down or dropped his pants and his underwear in accordance with the instruction. Pell then lowered his position so as to be almost crouched on his knees. Pell then started touching the boy's genitalia. While touching the boy's genitalia, Pell was touching his own genitalia. After a couple of minutes, Pell finished and stood up.
They were the little boys.
So to think that this happened to the little boys?
For it to happen to the little boys is just... They preach about God, they preach about love, love thy neighbour, and that's... They took away lives, took away innocence. That's not love. It questions your belief in a church. It's like all your life you're brought up that church is God and love, but if the church is this, there's no love.
What's your view about George Pell? What sort of person is he?
What type of person is... It's only a monster that can describe someone like that.
After the incident, the choir boys went home. One of them later told the court he didn't tell anyone.
The boy didn't say anything at the time about what had happened because he didn't want to jeopardise his scholarship in any way. He was also cognizant of the position held by the accused man and the possible ramifications that might flow from saying something about what happened.
About a month later, George Pell approached the second boy again in a back corridor of the cathedral.
It's alleged that the accused man, Pell, pushed the boy against the wall. He then squeezed the boy's genitals over his robes before letting go and walking off.
The events in the cathedral would change the course of their lives. The identities of the two 13-year-old victims and their families can't be revealed, but the family of the first choir boy wants to tell his story.
He went from being this lovely boy who used to come to the football with me, who used to go and help his grandparents and helped around the house, to this boy who kept wanting to go out all the time. His whole being just, it was a different boy.
Just totally different. Just didn't care about anything, didn't care about anyone, just didn't want to breathe. Like, you'd see him on the train and it was like, how you going? That's it. But deep down you think that, why are you rebelling so much? Like, what is it that you hate? Like, you could sense that there was a bit of hate there for authority.
Looking back, as a person, he changed. He did. He wasn't the same person as what he was beforehand. Yeah.
And it changed so much that his life really...
It spiralled. Yeah.
Yeah.
It did spiral.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Within a year of the abuse, their son began to use heroin.
He started, yes, I noticed some bits of foil that had been burnt. And I noticed that, my parents noticed that, his grandparents.
He was pretty young at this stage.
Yes, he was. He was.
How old?
He would have been about 13, 14 at the time. Yeah. Very young at the time, very young.
It's devastating to watch your child like that because of his drug use. It was very hard to watch.
At 14, he would spend nights where we wouldn't see him. He would disappear for a day or two and then turn up as though nothing had happened. His schooling, of course, became erratic, his attendance. He was at the point where the choir master was going to expel him. It meant that he would lose his scholarship and we would then have to pay. And we didn't have the thousands of dollars that were required to keep him there.
His mother suspected her son might have been abused.
I once asked him if he was, I can't exactly remember the words I used, whether he was touched up or played with, and he told me no, but again with a shrug. Again, a little niggling in there. I never said anything to anybody. A little niggling, I'm thinking, yeah, all right. He said no. And then a while after that, again, I asked him, and again he told me no. And then I get this, and I was just so angry with him for not telling me. So angry. Sometimes I'm still very angry.
Their son died of a heroin overdose in 2014. He took his secret about George Pell to his grave.
I don't tell a lot of people how he passed away. I tell part of the truth, but not all of it, because I don't want sympathy. I don't want the pity.
It's very hard to explain to people that my brother struggled for half his life with a drug abuse problem. And it's very hard, you know, I have never told anybody. It's devastating because it helps to explain a lot of incidents in his life. And it's devastating. It is.
It's hard when you think a child can't come out and say this has happened, because most times they're not believed. I would like to think I would have believed my son.
Yeah.
I would have believed my son.
It must be a really hard thing as a dad to contemplate.
It's the worst. It's the worst. I used to think when he died, I used to think, what a waste of a life. You know, 31 years old and you're dead. What a waste of a life.
The young man's death had a terrible impact on the other choir boy who was also abused by George Pell. After the funeral, the other boy finally told his own mother that he had been abused. She rang Bernard Barrett at the victims group Broken Rights.
I answered the phone and she explained that her son, who was a former choir boy, he was very upset because he'd had a troubled life since his teens, and he was telling her for the first time at the age of 30 about having been abused by a priest.
Later, Bernard Barrett spoke to the second choir boy.
He told me that when he was a choir boy at the Melbourne Cathedral, one day he was sexually abused by a prominent person in one of the rooms of the cathedral.
Who was that prominent person?
Well, he gave the name Archbishop Pell.
And that's how this investigation into Cardinal George Pell began.
When you get a figure like that, he's the highest ranked Catholic in Australia, he's a high position in the Vatican. We obviously had to treat things very seriously in relation to how we conducted the investigation to make sure that all the boxes were ticked as far as not letting information out. We had to be very secretive in relation to making sure that this wasn't put out into the public arena.
Doug Smith oversaw the investigation when it started.
Through your work with Task Force Sano and Victoria Police had had a lot of experience with these Catholic Church perpetrators. How did you find the Catholic Church in dealing with them in these cases?
They were very difficult to deal with. They would say that they wanted to cooperate with the police in relation to all these allegations, and they were openly saying that they would cooperate, but I think you could almost say that the way that they class their cooperation would be similar to a protester laying on the ground in the middle of the street, not resisting the police, but the police would have to pick that person up and drag them off the street. And I think that that's the level of cooperation that the Catholic Church gave us.
The police investigation into Pell widened. New claims were made about alleged abuse in the 1970s at the Eureka Stockade Pool in George Pell's hometown of Ballarat. Damien Dignan was 8 years old at the time. In 2015, he made a complaint to police. We spoke to him the following year.
Father Pell was all the up the deep end, sort of around his chest height there, and would love to pick the kids up and throw them over his shoulder, or throw them up in the air so they could have a splash.
So things got a bit rough, so what happened?
Around the testes, around the anus.
What would he do?
Grab you.
How did it make you feel?
Scared. Oh, so scared but hurt. Very forceful around the anus.
Could there ever be an interpretation that it just so happened that his hands weren't slipped down there, you know, by mistake?
Fair enough. One time, might have got to a stage where every time we picked her up, it was there. And not much fun, no. Get out of the pool.
Damien Dignan said he was terrified of Pell.
Probably today, I've even looked at him, I'll be still a scared little boy again. Don't get me wrong, I believe in the Catholic Church, I do. I believe in Jesus, I believe in God. That man is evil and he should not be there. Should not be there where he is. He's got a sickness.
And he told us about allegations that had happened against this other person.
And that person was Lyndon Monument?
That's correct, yes. Yep.
Lyndon Monument described playing the same game with George Pell in the pool.
Well, it was, you know, his hand touching your genitals and stuff on the outside of your bathers or your shorts. And then that slowly became hand down the front of the pants or your bathers or whatever you call them.
Under the water?
Under the water.
Lyndon Monument told police that Pell would then invite him into the change rooms.
He'd undress and then he'd say to us to undress. So we'd undress and then he'd have a towel, he'd say that you'd make sure you wiped under your testicles and all that sort of stuff.
And while he was doing this, was he wearing clothes?
No.
Ballarat local Phil Nagel said he also saw Pell in the change rooms.
Obviously, his kids pretty discreetly in the corner because we didn't want anyone to see our doodles and we were just little kids. Tapped me on the shoulder and looked around and there was, you know, Cardinal Pell, stark naked, and he was actually had his towel up and he was drying his back and there was no discretion at all. So he's actually the first adult male I ever saw naked.
I didn't like it, but because it was a church and just he was George Pell, you just weren't going to ever say anything, you know what I mean? So I just tried not to think about it, to be honest.
Lyndon and Damien went to primary school at Ballarat's epicentre of abuse, St Alipius, where a ring of pedophile Christian brothers and a priest abused dozens of children. George Pell lived in the St Alipius Presbytery at the same time as the notorious child abuser, Father Gerald Ridsdale. Both Lyndon and Damien told police they were also abused by teachers at the school. Lyndon's brother was one of many St Alipius pupils who later suicided.
That's why I took to drugs, just to blank it all out. And then still to this day, like, I know it sounds horrible and I'd never hurt myself because I love my family and my kids, but I don't really like living. Don't care if I get hit by a bus, but I'd never do anything to hurt my kids either, so just keep battling them.
You've got no confidence, you can't talk, and you'll never talk. You feel ashamed, and yeah, and as far as you ask me how it affects me mentally, ruined my life. Ruined it. For years, I was very angry. I grew up an angry young bloke. I took a lot of my anger out of myself, self-destruction, and other people that cared about me and loved me.
Damien Dignan had a drinking problem and he developed leukemia. Police laid charges in relation to his alleged abuse, but they were dropped when he died in January 2017. He was 47. He told me he was always proud of coming forward. Six months after the Ballarat men went to police, another man came forward. Les Tyack told police that in the mid-1980s, he saw Pell in the change rooms at the Torquay Lifesaving Club.
When I walked in, I saw a fellow there, crisscrossing across the back, toweling himself off, and there was three young kids, about 8 to 10 years of age. They were about two metres across from him, also getting changed. I went into the shower, and I would have been in the showers for probably 5 to 10 minutes. When I came out, this fellow was facing the boys with the towel over his right shoulder, and I thought that to be a very odd situation. Here I was in the shower. He had not got dressed. He was facing the boys, and I thought then immediately, there's something not right here. I said to the boys, if you're finished, off you go. We'll see you again some other time. And I said to this fellow, George, I know what you're up to. Get dressed, piss off, and don't come back to this club again. If I see you back here, I'll call the police.
And George was George Pell.
George was George Pell.
So what you're saying is that you thought that George Pell was exposing himself to those boys?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have no doubt whatsoever.
Les Tyack was inspired to speak up when the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Abuse began sitting.
Pell's name kept on coming up. I felt that that was the time that maybe I should put my statement into the police as to what had happened, because if they were forming some dossier on Pell, it might be some sort of backup and just another example of what this man was up to. I had no beef. I was not a victim. I had nothing against the Catholic Church, but this was a situation that did disturb me greatly.
In October 2016, Victoria Police made the decision to quietly fly to Rome to interview George Pell.
There would have been some level of secrecy that would have been required for that to happen. 3 people went over there to interview him, and that obviously would have been with the cooperation of the Catholic Church, and George Pell would have agreed to the interview taking place.
Cardinal Pell, do you agree the time is now 10:28 a.m. there on my watch?
I do.
Thank you. Can you please state your name and address?
My name is George Pell, and I live at number 1 Piazza della Cittadinanza in Rome.
Thank you. Now, Cardinal, today I intend to interview you in relation to the Victorian Australian offences of indecent assault upon a male and indecent act in the presence of a child under 16 years. Before we continue, I must inform you that you do not have to say or do anything, but anything you say or do may be given in evidence. Do you understand that?
I do.
The Cardinal started his interview with a statement.
I volunteered to take part in this interview because, as I understand, allegations made against me going back decades are made in vague and imprecisely defined circumstances and time frames, so that it's practically impossible to demonstrate a negative unless I'm given sufficient details to enable me to search the past and show them to be wrong. I have to rely on the law and my conscience, which say that I'm innocent, and I have to rely on the integrity of investigators, not setting out to make a case, but actually searching for the truth.
We'll go into some specifics.
I hope you do.
On this occasion, what's been alleged is that after Mass, on a particular Sunday in that time frame, were heading down the corridor and out towards the back, towards their robing room that the choir utilised, when they started poking around in various rooms they came across on their way through. As I said, they were poking around, which is the term that was utilised.
Well, that's an unfortunate term, but where were they poking? What do you do when you're poking around?
I take it to be that they were looking as they were walking along.
Go on.
The next part of the allegation is that you've planted yourself in a spot between these two boys and the doorway in the sacristy room.
After Sunday Mass?
Yes. Yes. And in effect prevented them from leaving the room. Now, the boys knew they were in a fair bit of trouble, and that at that time you've moved your robes to one side and exposed your penis.
Oh, stop it.
You're still at this stage standing with your back to the door.
What a load of absolute and disgraceful rubbish. Completely false. Madness. There are all sorts of people used to come to the sacristy to speak to the priest.
Yes.
The sacristans were around. The altar servers were around.
Mm-hmm.
They should have been on their way to change their vestments.
Yes. Now, it's been alleged that you've stepped forward, grabbed by the back of his head, and forced his head down onto your penis.
In the sacristy after Mass?
Yes. And
completely false.
This has gone on for a short period of time before you've let go of, grabbed his head and done the same instance, forced his head down onto your penis.
Completely false?
You don't have to comment at this stage, I can continue on.
Please do.
That's fine. The boys were terrified at this stage, and it's been described that you were holding his head at this time with two hands on the back of his head before stopping, at which time he stood back, was standing in the middle of the room beside him. It's been alleged that you then said, take off your pants, and you stepped up to him, knelt down, started to fondle his penis and masturbate yourself at the same time.
This is in the sacristy at the cathedral after Sunday Mass?
Yes.
Well, need I say any more? What a load of garbage and falsehood and deranged falsehood.
Good morning.
On June 29, 2017, Victoria Police made a historic announcement.
Today, Victoria Police have charged Cardinal George Pell with historical sexual assault offences. Cardinal Pell has been charged on summons and he's required to appear at the Melbourne Magistrates Court on the 18th of July this year for a filing hearing. The charges were today served on Cardinal Pell's legal representatives in Melbourne and they've been lodged also at the Melbourne Magistrates Court. Cardinal Pell is facing multiple charges in respect to historic sexual offences and there are multiple complainants relating to those charges. I'm not in a position to take any questions here this morning and I'm moving forward. Victoria Police won't be making any further comments in respect to this matter.
Good morning to you all. I want to say one or two brief words about my situation. These matters have been under investigation now for 2 years. There have been leaks to the media. There's been relentless character assassination, a relentless character assassination. And for more than a month, claims that a decision
on whether to lay charges was imminent. I'm looking forward, finally, to having my day in court. I'm innocent of these charges. They are false. The whole idea of sexual abuse is abhorrent to me.
Thank you all very much for coming.
George Pell flew back to Australia. So began a gruelling 20-month court drama. The case depended on the testimony of the sole surviving choir boy who'd been abused by Pell in the cathedral. Andrew LaGreca also gave evidence in the Pell court proceedings.
I was vigorously questioned and I was a witness, so I could imagine how much how strenuous the questioning would be, questioning every thought and every movement he did back then, let alone the stress that he would be under. And now it's coming back to haunt him. I could just imagine the stress and pain he went through just in that trial.
Even as a policeman who goes through court proceedings a lot, you feel very uncomfortable because it's almost in a threatening way. I mean, it's threatening with words. It's questioning your truthfulness, it's questioning your character. And a policeman can walk away at the end of the day and think, oh, you know, that was difficult. But when it comes from a complainant or a victim's point of view, I mean, it can be devastating to them to be called a liar.
In May 2017, Pell was committed to trial by a magistrate. The public remained entirely in the dark about what Pell was being tried for, how many complainants were involved, and how many charges he faced. The cathedral trial was held entirely in secret. The Office of Public Prosecutions wanted to eliminate any argument by the defence that the Cardinal couldn't get a fair trial. Pell went to trial in August last year, but that resulted in a hung jury. In December, in a retrial, the jury found George Pell guilty of all 5 charges against the 2 choir boys. They included 1 count of sexual penetration of a child and 4 of indecent acts with a child or in the presence of a child.
He was in a position of trust. He was trusted, and yet he does this sort of thing. And it's been, you know, been proven in court that he did. We have to say that. And myself, I'm just disgusted. I'm disgusted in the Catholic Church.
What does it say about the Catholic Church?
It's let people down. It let my son down.
It must be a huge mountain to climb for the police.
For sure. They've been nothing but professional. They've gone through some painstaking investigations leading up to getting statements, putting everything together to support a conviction beyond reasonable doubt for someone like a cardinal of the Catholic Church. I mean, they've done a fantastic job, and they can certainly hold their heads up high.
At the time of his conviction, Pell was facing a separate trial on the allegations of abuse at the Ballarat pool. The news was suppressed so as not to taint the jury in the second trial. Last week, the Ballarat pool trial was abandoned because some key evidence was ruled inadmissible.
Way back, thank you.
As a result of that decision, Finally, the veil of secrecy was lifted.
It can now be revealed that Australia's most senior Catholic Cardinal George Pell has been convicted of sexually abusing 2 choir boys in 1996 when he was Archbishop of Melbourne.
Stay back. Thank you. Stay back.
I was devastated. Cardinal George Pell has always been such a personification of the Church in the public life of Australia, and to get to a point where he's convicted for these sorts of crimes, in a sense, is a conviction more broadly about the Catholic Church. It's culture that has led to this.
Despite having brought the third most powerful Catholic in the world to justice, the man who was the 13-year-old choir boy just wants to be left alone.
My client's had a very long journey. The criminal process has been quite stressful for him, and it's not over yet. Like many survivors, my client has experienced depression, loneliness, struggle with various issues over time. And one common feature that we often see in doing this kind of work is people feel that they have trusted somebody who they should have feared when they were a child, and that it has long-term impacts on their relationships for the rest of their life. And it can be difficult for survivors to trust those people who are genuine and should be trusted. He feels that he trusted someone he should have feared.
He's a credit to himself, and he needs to be congratulated because he he's done a very, very good job at being believed. I mean, all he can do is tell the truth. He can't do any more than that. And for a jury of his peers to believe him, I mean, it's fantastic.
Just, he is a hero. I think deep down he wasn't just doing it for himself. Deep down he was doing it for someone else as well.
There's someone else who wasn't here.
Yeah.
Cardinal Pell, what's your response to the charges? You're guilty, Cardinal. Absolute pig. You're a monster. Mate, you bloody hell.
County Court Chief Judge Peter Kidd described Pell's crimes as callous, brazen offending. He exploited 2 vulnerable boys, and there was an element of force. There was an element of brutality to this assault. It was an attack. George Pell maintains his innocence and is appealing. A 77-year-old man who once cast an enormous shadow over the Australian church and culture is now in jail awaiting sentence.
There's probably going to be millions of people out there who will look at it and think how important it is that no one's above the law. The Catholic Church isn't above the law. A lot of times the system doesn't work, but this time the system has worked, and there's going to be a lot of people who are going to benefit from that.